We're in a series of messages that Peter is giving us out of 1st and 2nd Peter. And we're in 1st Peter. And today we're looking at the 2nd chapter of 1st Peter. And we'll be reading some verses there. I was reading a story this last week about some families last July in 2017, who were in a state park north of Phoenix, kind of up in the hills a little bit. And one man was up there and he had pitched his tent, you know, in a nice place up there. And another group of people were all family, extended family. I think the youngest was 2 years old and the oldest was 60. And there were probably 9 or so people in that group. And they were up there in what was left of some water that made a little swimming hole. And everybody, the man that pitched his tent and the family, they were having a great time. And they had no idea that up in the mountains, it came a thunderstorm up there, pouring down rain. And they happened to have pitched their tent and they were swimming in part of a gully that actually, when there's a lot of water that comes down out of the mountains, becomes a raging river. And they didn't know it. And so, with no warning, what I read was that the water was over 6 feet tall and it had trees and all kinds of things in it. And it just came barreling down through the gully that they were in. And it took the man away and his tent that he'd pitched, and took all the members of that family away. And everybody that had been in that place died because they were in the wrong place. They had pitched their tent and they had decided to have a good time in the wrong place. And they didn't understand how dangerous that was. I'm telling us that story because I think Peter is reminding us again that we are sojourners. We are not permanent here in this world. We are looking forward to eternity with God. And so in the meantime, we are here. But I think Peter is warning us that we need to be careful where we pitch our tents and where we might find a place to relax in the world. And we're going to look at 1 Peter 2 today. So if you want to turn over there, we'll be in a few verses there today. 1 Peter 2. And we'll start with verse 11. And just read a few verses here. Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims. Where have we heard that? Wasn't that the first thing that Peter had said to this church when we did chapter 1? Yes. Yeah, sojourners and pilgrims. So he's reminding them again. This must really be important. So we need to really pay attention. Abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. You remember we looked at the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life in one of our previous messages that Peter gave us. Here he's telling them again, be careful. Be careful that you don't get caught up in fleshly lusts that war against our soul. Having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works which they observe glorify God in the day of visitation. So in your notes, our first major point is about our conduct as it's observed by the world, or our conduct as it's observed by unbelievers. I would say that we have more people observing us individually than we know. The world and unbelievers are watching each one of us. They're watching us as a church too. But they're specifically watching each one of us. And what are they watching for? Well, let's look at these points that I have under our conduct and how important our conduct is that Peter talks to us about. First of all, he reminds us, as we said, we're sojourners and pilgrims, and we should stay away from the things of the flesh. Those things are like that storm that came down through the ravine and killed those people. That is exactly how fleshly lust can take over our lives, and we need to watch out for that. And they war against the soul. In other words, what our belief is and our commitment to God in Jesus Christ. The flesh wars against that commitment. Now, our conduct is supposed to be honorable, Peter said in these verses. And that way, when the Gentiles speak evil against, Peter said, when the Gentiles speak evil against you, that they will glorify God during the day of visitation. Now let's talk about those two verses for a little bit so we understand that. In verse 12, our conduct needs to be honorable, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. What this is saying is that right now, while you and I are living for Christ, and we're doing good works for Christ, there are people in the world who will speak evil of us because they speak evil of Christ. And anytime you and I stand up for Christ, somebody is not going to like that. And so at different times, and I've heard different ones of you talk about taking a stand for Jesus to people. They're not really going to like that. And they may even go so far as to speak evil of you and speak against you. But what this verse says is that in the day that God visits, they will glorify God because of the good works that they saw you do. Now, there's a couple interpretations of day of visitation. One is that God draws everybody to Him, and there are people that you wouldn't think would even accept Jesus, and God draws them, and they end up being convicted and accepting Jesus. That could be a day of visitation of God to that particular person, okay? Or this could be at the end of the time that these people would be alive, and Christ comes back. That may be the day of visitation. And then you, when Christ comes back for the church, you will be gone, and those people will be left. And they will glorify God because of the works that you've been doing, you see. And then they may in fact accept Jesus during the tribulation. We don't know. But that's what Peter's reminding us of here. Do good works so that unbelievers who may speak badly of you right now will, in the day of visitation, either when God comes to them personally or when God comes for the church and all these people are left, they will give God the glory. So that's the reason that our conduct is so important. And we need to be careful where we pitch our tent, because the world wants you and me to pitch our tent with them. And Satan, of course, is behind all of that. You know, you think of what's an example of pitching your tent with the world. Okay? We're going to get to a few of them in just a minute, and we'll talk about that. But we need to pitch our tent with God, not with the world. Let's look at the next few verses, starting with 13, going down through verse 17. This is submit to every ordinance of man or of government. That's the title that I've given this section. Submit to every ordinance of the government. Now verse 13 tells us we should submit ourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme, or to governors, as to those who are sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of those who do good. This is the will of God, that by doing so you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. Okay? Now, what are these ordinances? Well, these are the laws that different countries, different men set up. And God is talking about ordinances for the Lord's sake. God puts people in power for a reason. And we're told here that it might be a governor, it might be a king, it might be those who are sent to punish evildoers. But these governments punish evildoers, but they also praise good overall. Now every once in a while you're going to run across a bad ruler, a bad country, somebody that evil has taken over. But by and large, what Peter is saying here is, you submit to these ordinances. Now, why should we do that? Because, verse 15, this is the will of God. That's why we submit to ordinances. That by doing good, you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. You remember we said there's people watching us and watching our conduct that we don't even know about? Okay, the world is looking for a reason to be able to point to you and me and say, I told you. They say one thing and they do something else. They're hypocrites. I'm not going to be involved with hypocrites. Do you ever hear anybody talk about the church that way? It's just a bunch of hypocrites.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that we sometimes do that give them reason to say that is we're not submitting ourselves to every ordinance of man. Sometimes we might get in a position where we decide what we're going to submit to and what we're not going to submit to. And we make that decision. Well, I'll guarantee you there are people watching us. And when we decide we're not going to submit to an ordinance of government, they take note of that. This is the will of God, because if we do that, by doing good, you put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. And then our freedom is not used as a cloak for vice, in other words, breaking the law, but it's a bondservant of God. That's why we follow these ordinances. Okay? So, and it can be anything, really, that we decide, well, we're not going to follow that. We're not going to do what the government is telling us to do. And verse 16 says, we are really bondservants of God. So if you look down through the notes for submit to every ordinance in 2 Peter 2:13 through 17, you find out that Peter didn't say submit to some ordinances. Peter said submit to every or all ordinances. Now, these punish evildoers, these ordinances do, but they also praise those who do good. Okay? Now, our good deeds silence foolish men. This is how God determines to silence foolishness today that's opposite His Word. Our good deeds, we actually put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. And then finally, our liberty as a bondservant of God, we end up doing three things. And I've listed them here that were in 1 Peter 2:13 through 17. First of all, Peter says, honor all people and the king. What does that mean, to honor all people and the king? Well, what it means is you treat everybody with respect. You know? You don't take somebody that has a lot of worldly goods and has high positions in the world and give them more respect than somebody who doesn't. You give honor to all people, including the king. In our case, that would be the president, okay, of the United States.
I'm not doing that.
But we should not use our liberty, our freedom in Christ to go against this. God says we're to honor all people and especially the king. He also says, second, we're to love the brotherhood. Okay? So we need to be able to show love to people who are believers. Now, honestly, the world is watching us do that too. Well, one thing that really turns the world on to talking about hypocrites is for us to talk about loving the brotherhood, and then there's somebody in the brotherhood who has a need, and all we do is pray for them and we don't help them. Okay? So we need to not only be doing good deeds, period, but we also need to be making sure that we love the brotherhood. And then finally he says, fear God. That means respect God. Have a high respect for God. Now when people see that, then they will give God the glory sooner or later, is what he's saying. Now the third thing that Peter's reminding us of is in verses 18 through 25. Now this is a subject that we fought a civil war over in this country. We had hundreds of thousands of people die over slavery, over being servants. But you notice here that in the biblical times there were people who had servants. Most of the time those servants were cared for and had what they needed. But sometimes they were treated harshly. Look what he says to servants. Be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle ones, but also to the harsh ones. So you be good, you be submissive to those who basically can tell you what they would like for you to be doing. And you need to do that. Be submissive. Verse 19, this is commendable if because of conscience toward God one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. For what credit is it if when you're beaten for your faults you take it patiently, but when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. What this is saying is, if you have somebody, in this case, who actually beats you and treats you badly, and you endure patiently, well, that's one thing. But for you to be doing good and to have somebody beat you for doing good or take advantage of you for being good, Peter is saying you suffer that. You suffer through that for Jesus. And he says it's commendable. Now that is a hard thing as a human being to do. Because if I'm doing good for somebody and they treat me really badly, the flesh in me wants to say, okay, buddy, you're not going to get any more from me, and furthermore, I may even go after you. Now that's what the flesh tells us we have the right to do. But Peter says, no, don't do that. Verse 21, he explains, for to this you are called, because Christ also suffered. He left us an example that you should follow in his steps. So we may find ourselves suffering. Other people may cause us to suffer. And Peter is saying, endure that grief. Don't try to take vengeance on them. Christ is our example. So we're going to end today by looking at one of the churches in Revelation 3. So why don't you turn over there. We'll end with this. You know, Jesus wrote 7 letters that he gave John to seven churches. And he wrote in, starting in verse 14 of chapter 3, he wrote to the 7th church. Now what's interesting, I don't know if you've ever thought about this. If you take every one of those churches and you line them up, here's church 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7's over here. If you look at church 1, it talks about and looks like the first century church, back when Jesus left. And if you follow those churches and what Jesus wrote to them, and you come up here to the last church, church 7, which is Laodicea, you can see that it's a clear picture of what the church will be like when Jesus comes back. So we're going to look at this Laodicean church, because this has to do with what Peter has been teaching us. First of all, let's start in verse 14. The angel of the church of the Laodiceans write, "These things says the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of the creation of God." Now what that means is, this is Jesus Christ talking to this church. He's talking to the church of today. And look what he says to the church of today. "I know your works. You are neither hot nor cold. I wish you were cold or hot. So then, because you are lukewarm and neither cold or hot, I'm going to vomit you out of my mouth." Now, can you imagine Jesus saying that to a church today? We don't want him to say that about our church. We don't want Jesus to say, you know, Believers Bible Fellowship Church, I wish you were either cold or hot. But since you're lukewarm, I'm going to vomit Believers Bible Fellowship Church out of my mouth. Now, why would that disturb Jesus so badly for a church to be lukewarm? Well, if you're not hot and you're not cold, you're not much of anything. You're not doing much, really. And if we read on, he's going to explain. "Because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I vomit you out of my mouth." And here he tells us why. "Because you say, I'm rich. I've become wealthy. I don't have need of anything." We, as a church, should not feel that way. If we begin to think that way or feel that way or act that way, we need to be careful. And we need to help each other and the church turn around. They said, we don't need you, Jesus. We have everything. We're doing just fine by ourselves. But Jesus said in verse 17, "Do you not know that you're wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked? I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, that you may be rich." See, they had money. This church had money. And because they had money, they thought they were all set. And Jesus said, no, you're not. You're not all set just because you have money. As a matter of fact, you're wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. Now, how could he say that to this church? Well, they were putting their trust in them and what they had instead of in Jesus. He says you should have white garments, that you could be clothed, and that the shame of your nakedness would not be revealed. Anoint your eyes with salve that you may see. So they were actually blinded by all that they had and all that they were blessed with, instead of using that money. Now, we had a parable last week that Nels taught. You remember the parable about the man who wanted to tear down his barns, put more in it, build bigger barns, fill it full, then he could just sit back and take it easy? Okay? That's lukewarmness. That's being lukewarm. And that's what Jesus was criticizing the last day church about. Then in verse 19 he says, "Now as many as I love, I rebuke and chasten, therefore be zealous and repent." I stand at the door and I knock. If anybody hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and dine with him. Now, he didn't say, I stand at the door of the church and I'm knocking, and if the church opens the door and the church lets me in, then I'm ready to come in. He didn't say that. He said, as many as I love, I rebuke. Therefore, if anyone hears my voice, he's talking about individuals. He's talking about each one of us. You know what? If you hear the voice of Jesus and you open the door, then he will come in and dine with you and you with him. That's what Jesus is saying. He's making it very personal. There are people today in churches who believe that because they are a member of a church, that takes care of it. Just come to church, put money in the collection, sing songs, hear a message, eat together, and everything's fine. And Jesus is saying, no, you can do all that and still be lukewarm. You can do all that and still be lukewarm. To him that overcomes, I'm going to grant to sit with me in my throne, and I also overcome and sit down with my Father at his throne. So Peter warned those believers about getting caught up in the world and staking their tent in dangerous places in the world. John wrote what Jesus warned the church in this last age to be careful about, thinking that we have everything we need, and yet we're lukewarm. Basically, we're sitting with ourselves, among ourselves, doing for ourselves with what we feel like we have accumulated. That's what Jesus is talking about of the last church before he comes back to take the church. And I know we don't want to be that way, but Peter is reminding us to be careful. Be careful. Don't get that attitude. Don't be lukewarm. He'd rather the church would be cold or hot. Okay, much rather. He can deal with a cold church and he can deal with a hot church, but he isn't going to hold on to a lukewarm church. So these are some encouragements for us. Our conduct, we want to make sure where we pitch our tents. We want to make sure where we settle down a little bit. Make sure that the world isn't going to sweep us away like that flood that came down that ravine for those people. Submit to every ordinance of man. Think about our life. Is there any ordinance that the government has set up that we absolutely don't follow? Or that we sometimes say, well, I don't need to follow it right now. And we don't. Because people are watching us. And they will make decisions about the Lord based on things like that. And then finally, we are going to suffer grief in this world if we stand up for Jesus Christ. There are a lot of people that don't like that. And then finally, we're being encouraged by John and Jesus to not be a lukewarm church. So that's our message from 1 Peter 2 today. Next week, the message is about wives and husbands. And we'll have some interesting things there, I'm sure. So let's ask God's blessing on this message today. Father, I want to thank you for your truth in your word. I thank you for the truth that we as believers, we know that we are being watched by the world and by unbelievers. Help us, Lord, to always be an example, to always follow the ordinances of our government, to not to give anybody reason to call the church today hypocritical. And thank you, Lord, for being with us when we suffer. Because if we're like Jesus, and if we teach Jesus, we will suffer. You told us that. And we should rejoice in that. So help us, Lord, to understand that. Give us opportunities this week to share with people who are in the world, who aren't aware of these raging storms that can come up and just wipe them out, literally, and take them away. Help us to share the gospel with people this week. And we give you all the glory and praise in Jesus' name. Amen.